watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Wednesday evening, joined by Father Deacon Anthony Dragani, an Eastern Catholic deacon, returning back to the show to discuss the Eastern Catholic perspective on liturgical changes after the Second Vatican Council. This is an exciting topic. I mean, there are so many things going on here. I mean, first of all, I love hearing anything about Eastern Catholicism, but then on liturgical changes after Vatican II, I mean, this is good stuff. So I'm looking forward to this, and I hope you all are as well. Father Deacon Anthony, welcome back to the show, and how are you?
Thank you, Michael. It's a joy being here for this rather explosive topic.
It's a very explosive topic because we know the different views that Latin Rite Catholics have about the post-conciliar changes when it comes to the liturgy, but often we don't hear a whole lot about the Eastern Catholic perspective on said topic. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Go ahead and maybe lay out some of your thoughts on the matter.
Sure. So first of all, I wanted to preface this by saying that I don't speak for Eastern Catholicism as a whole, right? I'm only speaking for myself, but I'm trying to draw from the general perspective of Eastern Catholic theologians and writers on this topic. So I'm going to focus primarily on the Western liturgical reforms. In the East, Vatican II was very clear that we Eastern Catholics have to restore our patrimony. You know, there was a issue with Latinization, which means that many Eastern Catholic churches were mimicking Latin practices, and the Catholic Church and Vatican II were very clear we had to restore things to be authentically Eastern again. That's all I'm going to say about our side of it for right now. But as an Eastern Catholic, I've been watching kind of the angst and the liturgical squabbling going on in the Western Church, and I thought it'd be helpful to offer kind of a perspective from the outside looking in. So I think we need to begin with this premise that the purpose of liturgical reform is to help people develop a stronger relationship with God. I think any kind of liturgical reform needs to be based around that. You know, liturgy for most of us is how we encounter God in a very tangible way, as tangible as we can, you know, through the Eucharist, through worship. So it's important that any reforms be designed to help bring people closer to God, to have a more powerful experience, so to speak, of encountering God in the liturgy. So I think we need to begin there with that as the premise. And I do believe at Vatican II that was the goal. You know, if you read Sacrosanctum Concilium, it talks about a vision of liturgy that is in continuation with tradition, but also has greater active participation. It wasn't calling for like a radical new approach to liturgy. It was calling for, in many ways, a reform to get back to perhaps older usages that were more accommodating of active participation from everyone there. So I think that was the goal, ultimately. And I think the problem is, when it was time to implement all of this, the culture, our modern culture, became a very powerful influence in the implementation on the ground. I think that's a big part of the problem. But I do believe, from the outside looking in, that the actual liturgical texts produced, when properly translated, were in many ways faithful to the Roman tradition, and they were in many ways an improvement. That's just my perspective as an outsider. I've studied liturgy. I've studied the so-called Tridentine Mass. I've studied the current so-called Novus Ordo Mass, and I've studied older liturgies in the Western and Eastern churches. And the Roman Mass that was produced after Vatican II, the so-called Novus Ordo, or Liturgy of Paul VI, as some people call it, was very much in continuation with the tradition of the Roman Church going back many centuries. It was not this dramatic aberration that some people make it out to be. I think there's a lot of positive things there. I think the problem, though, is when this liturgy with this beautiful text was put into action, first of all, there's a translation issue. Right here in the United States and in English-speaking countries, there's a huge translation issue initially. You're familiar with the ISOL translation, the older one, Michael?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, a wake-up call was when I was in graduate school. I was at Duquesne University studying Latin, and as an exercise, they had us translate the Roman Mass from Latin to English, the current Roman Mass. And I was shocked at how different the actual text was in Latin from the translation being used in, the actual parishes. Now, that has been largely fixed. I think the current translation in use in the United States, at least, is much more faithful to the Latin text, much more. But point is, when this first started being promulgated, most people in the English-speaking world were given what could only be described as a paraphrase as opposed to a translation. So right off the bat, that made it hard to actually experience what was meant to be experienced. But then other liturgical innovations kind of started popping in, some of them sanctioned by church officials, some of them not. I think the idea of celebrating Mass facing the people was a bit problematic in some ways. I'm not opposed to that. I can see the benefit of it in certain circumstances. And the Eastern churches would not work for us. Can it work in the Western church? Maybe. But I think with that came a danger that nobody really foresaw, which was there's too much of a temptation for the priest's personality to become the focus of attention. In my church, the priest is facing east with everybody else, kind of like a captain, leading a ship. We're all facing the same direction. And his personality, it comes out in the homily. But for the most part, his personality, whatever it is, doesn't dominate the liturgy. But when you have the celebrant facing the people, I think there is too much of a temptation, at least in many cases, for the liturgy to become about the priest and his personality. I think that's one of the issues that came out of it. I think the other issue too was, and this is a big one, the complete lack of transcendence in how it was implemented in most places. And by that I mean people are longing for something greater than us. We're longing for something beyond us that plugs us into something bigger, something more powerful. Our culture right now is sick. It's poisonous in many ways. And I think people are longing for something that connects them with something greater. And sadly, transcendence was kind of sucked out of the Roman Mass as it was implemented in most places. Not everywhere. I've been to Roman Catholic Masses, Novus Ordo, that are beautiful and transcendent. But that's rare. That's extremely rare in my experience. The vast majority are lacking any sense of transcendence. And I think there was a purposeful attempt to make the liturgy play nice with our culture as opposed to challenging the culture. And in the process, all transcendence was lost. So I saw this article recently. You may have seen it as well. It's been making the rounds on Facebook. National Catholic Reporter, by no means a conservative publication. One of their writers attended a Hindu worship service at a Hindu temple. Did you see this article?
I have not.
And it was an assignment he was given for a class. So he went to it and he wrote about it. And he wrote about how taken aback he was with the beauty of it. He said, it was amazing. He said, they were chanting, and the chant was the most mystifying. There was incense filling the air, and the smell of the incense kind of pulled you into the worship. And there were beautiful images and pictures and statues everywhere. And I'm thinking, if he walked into a Roman Catholic church and saw the same thing, he would have probably been horrified. I don't know him, but I suspect it would have been the case, because very often the people who write for the publication feel a certain way about liturgy. Not all of them, but most of them do. But I thought that was interesting that he was really appreciative of the beauty of this in a Hindu temple, but the reality is you can't find this in most Roman Catholic churches. You probably remember this back in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was a whole wave of popular recordings of Gregorian chant. And, these Gregorian chant CDs were selling quickly, right off the shelves. And there actually were like modern musical groups. They were doing songs kind of based on Gregorian chant, where they incorporate chant into the music. It was very, very popular. But the one place you couldn't find Gregorian chant was in a Roman Catholic church. So I think there is a longing for transcendence, and that longing for transcendence was largely ignored when the reforms were implemented in most places. And I think you ended up with a liturgy that does not seem transcendent to most people the way they experience it. they see a liturgy that seems to be trying very hard to blend in and be part of the culture. And I think that's why there's such a negative reaction to it in so many quarters. I tend to think that if the Novus Ordo had been implemented with the priest facing east, with incense and chant and singing, I don't think there would have been the same negative reaction to it. I don't. And I think many of the people right now who are flocking to the parishes that use the older liturgy, the Tridentine Mass, I think many of those people would have been happy staying in a typical Roman Catholic parish if the liturgy had been implemented differently. I'll stop there and let you say something.
I think that's definitely the case. A lot of people who attend the traditional Latin Mass, as they call it, I think it's somewhat of a misnomer, but those who attend this Mass, I don't think that they really are aware of the nitty gritty when it comes to the differences between the two missals. I think they're just drawn more to the piety and the incense and the ad Orientum and things like that they see in the older Mass. And so I think you're right. If those elements were still present in the majority of Novus Ordos, I don't think that people would really say, no, I still have to go to this older. No, that wouldn't be the case.
That's what I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, you mentioned facing the people there, and I kind of have a question. You said that in your estimation, leads to making it about the priest and his personality. How exactly is it that facing the people lends itself to that danger?
Mhm.
What exactly is it about that posture and orientation?
Yeah. And to be clear, it isn't always the case. I've seen priests who are very good at keeping their personalities out of it. But I think when the priest is looking at the people and the people are looking at the priest face to face, there's an expectation of performance. The priest is going to do something that meets something perhaps entertaining that keeps them engaged. I think that expectation is there. Whether we want to admit it or not, I think that's, an unconscious thing. That when we're facing a group of people, we're a bit nervous and we're thinking, how do I please them? I think that's programmed into us. That's why so many people have a fear of public speaking. So I think if you're the priest and you're facing, a congregation full of people, and the congregation full of people are facing you, on your end, you're going to be thinking, all right, how do I do a good job of giving them what they're here for, right? And on their end, they're thinking, okay, is this guy going to keep me engaged? I mean, in many ways, you experience the same thing if you say go to a comedy nightclub. It's very different, of course, but you have somebody on the stage facing a group of people, and people facing that person, and their expectations on both sides of some sort of performance taking place. I think anytime you have a person facing other people, that's kind of what we expect inherently. So for many priests, this became a situation where they have to figure out, how do I keep these people engaged? How do I keep them interested? How do I not lose them? How do I not do a bad job of public speaking? I mean, on a primal level, that's what it is. So I think that led to a lot of liturgical experimentation on the part of priests who are trying very hard to keep people engaged. And to their credit, you can't really blame them in most cases for doing that, in as much as we all want to please the audience who's in front of us. But the sad thing is that's not really what this is about. This isn't about pleasing an audience. It's about worshiping God.
It's coming up here in the chat, and it's very much related to what we're discussing right now. You do have this tendency in the Novus Ordo parishes to turn the liturgy into a theater and make it, a spectacle because of this orientation, for example. That's one of the reasons, as you noted. Was this, however, still a problem that you could find in certain parts of even the Tridentine Mass, for example, Mozart masses, which I've been to and I thought was incredibly awesome, yet still it did seem a little theatrical to me. So would you say that, was it not the case that this was still a problem even in the preconciliar liturgy?
That's always a potential issue with any liturgy. It becomes more about performance than worshiping God. I mean, that could happen in the Eastern liturgy. You can go to an Eastern Catholic church where they have an amazing choir, and sometimes the theatrics is given more attention than the sacred worship taking place. That can happen anywhere, but I do think when you have the celebrant, the presider facing the people, that temptation is magnified significantly. Now, again, I'm not saying that every Roman Catholic church should go back to ad orientem. I'm not. That's not my call. I have no dog in this fight. But I do think that particular change really dramatically impacted the dynamics of worship in the Western Church.
It was Ratzinger who noted that ad orientem is a tradition that goes back to the apostles, not a divine apostolic tradition, but a human apostolic tradition. However, it still is a human apostolic tradition, and for the Roman Church to change this without really good reason, it seems problematic. Do you think that there was a good reason for this change?
Maybe there was. I've never ran across it, but maybe there was a good reason. I think a lot of it had to do with Protestant influence.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the bishops, who were implementing this, were increasingly friendly with their Protestant neighbors, which is actually a very good thing. But I think in some cases they started mimicking them. And I think that may have been in part behind that. Because, here's the other side of this. We've talked about this before. At Vatican II, there was a very strong Eastern influence of Vatican II. The Eastern Catholic bishops had a lot of influence of Vatican II, even though they were very small in number. If you look at what they were involved in, they accomplished a tremendous amount, especially the Melkites. I mean, the Melkite Patriarch, the Melkite bishops, their interventions were remarkable. And, the Council Fathers watched all these Eastern liturgies taking place. They were impressed by it. And during this time, too, there was also a liturgical movement that had been going on for decades before Vatican II in the Western Church, of people who wanted to kind of reform the liturgy to make it, in their minds, more faithful to the more primitive Roman Rite. And many of these people were very impressed by the Eastern liturgies. During this time period, of course, what was going on in Europe was a lot of Russians were fleeing Russia and going to Paris. And in Paris, there was a big community of Eastern Orthodox Christians. They have a seminary there that's pretty renowned. And a lot of the Catholics were seeing and interacting with these Russian Orthodox, clergy in Paris. And they were so blown away by the Eastern liturgy. And they could see things in it that they felt reflected things that had been lost in the Roman Rite. So that movement had been building before Vatican II even happened. And then in Vatican II, the Council Fathers, most of them were pretty enamored with the divine liturgies they saw. And they realized a lot of the things they're seeing in the divine liturgy were actually part of their past. And we're talking about things such as liturgy in the vernacular. We're talking about things such as a freestanding altar that people can, walk around and incense around. Communion under both species was another big one. Also, the idea of an anaphora with an epiclesis, that was something that also spoke to them, even though that wasn't necessarily part of the Roman tradition. That was something they found pretty appealing. So at the council, they were so heavily influenced by this Eastern influence, but when it came time to implement it on the ground, I think most bishops looked more towards the Protestants and forgot about the Eastern Christians.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. You had mentioned earlier that there were some positive changes that came out of the liturgical reform. Maybe first tell us about those before we dive in to some of the Eastern aspects.
Okay, so this is going to sound like heresy. Liturgy in the vernacular. Having liturgy in a language that people understand. I see that as a very positive thing. Very positive thing. And I think that alone does encourage active participation. I know many people who love the Latin Mass, and I love the Latin language. I had 4 years of Latin. But for the average person attending church, attending liturgy in a language they don't understand, that does become a barrier to active participation. It does. So I think liturgy moving into the vernacular was a very positive thing that happened in the Roman Church. No, I'm not saying the Latin should have been abolished altogether, but I'm saying making it so people could understand what was going on was probably very helpful. Communion under both species, that making a comeback, I think, was a very positive thing, although it seems to be on hold right now in most places because of the pandemic, but I'm sure it'll come back in some way. Those are things that were very positive. Also, if you look at the Roman Mass as it's now celebrated, there's a lot more participation from the congregation in the responses. In our Eastern liturgies, a lot of it is almost like a call and response format. You have the deacon leading the intercessions, the people responding, and it goes back and forth the whole way through the liturgy for the most part. In the pre-Vatican II Roman Mass, as it had taken shape in the late Middle Ages, there was very little of that, very little. So I think those were all positive things. And I think a lot of good came from that. But unfortunately, a lot of things happened at the same time that I think turned people off. The people who love the Latin Mass today, some of them might be there because they really do love the Latin language, and that's awesome if they do. But my suspicion is most of them aren't there really for the Latin. They're there for the transcendence. And in their minds, they probably associate Latin with transcendence. But if the Novus Ordo was being celebrated with transcendence, with the chant, with the incense, more than likely they'd find what they're looking for there as well.
You had mentioned there that a lot of the fathers at the council were influenced by the Eastern liturgies, and yet when it came time to implement things, they were more influenced by Protestants. Why do you think that happened? Why didn't the fathers just simply, and especially the concilium after the fact, just simply kind of go in the direction of the East instead of Protestantism?
Well, I think what was going on, it wasn't so much they wanted to go in the direction of the East as much as they wanted to restore what they saw as lost elements in the Roman Rite, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But they saw in the East things that they imagined they had lost. Whether that's accurate or not, I'm not sure, but many of them thought they saw that, right? So they were very influenced by what they saw in the East, but when it came time to exercise it, I tend to think that there was something going on in the zeitgeist where they saw modernism as being something they had to embrace without calling it modernism, but I think they saw the modern world as something they had to engage with. I mean, right there in Vatican II, they talked a lot in the council about engaging the modern world, right? So I think in their minds, in the minds of many of them, the modern world, in many cases, equaled the Protestant majority in the countries that some of them were located in. That could have been part of it. So it's hard to know exactly why it went that direction, but I think in a lot of cases it had to do with engaging the modern world. And in their mind, the modern world reflected Protestantism more than anything else.
Speaking of some recent liturgical changes, what do you, maybe offer the Eastern Catholic perspective on them, such as Traditionis Custodes? I mean, this is a obviously very recent post-conciliar change. What's your impression there as an Eastern Catholic?
That's the one that just came out a few months ago, right?
Right.
Limiting the celebration of the older liturgy in the Roman Church.
Right.
Okay, this is a powder keg and a half, isn't it?
Yeah.
First of all, I want to state that I am very sympathetic to the people who are affected by this. I have many friends who belong to traditional Latin parishes who were deeply hurt and betrayed when that came out. And I understand their reasoning because they saw it almost as like an attack on the legitimacy of how they worship. And they felt they had made such real inroads, since Pope Benedict. And it was almost like the rug was pulled out from under them. I get that. On the other hand, I actually took the time to read through the document. I imagine you did as well. And when I read through the document, the reasoning of Pope Francis made some level of sense to me. I'm not saying it was a prudent decision. I'm not a judge of that. Maybe it was prudent, maybe it wasn't. But I could see his logic. And what it came down to, from what I could tell, is this. When Pope Benedict allowed for the widespread celebration of the Latin Mass by any Roman priest, I'm pretty sure he didn't state it was to be forever. He said that after a certain period of time, they would revisit this and there'd be feedback from bishops. I recall that being mentioned in the document. So they received this feedback, and a lot of the feedback was from bishops who were concerned because they saw communities developing that were full of poison and vitriol. And they reported this back to Pope Francis. So Pope Francis also saw this from his perspective. So what did he do? He put the liturgy back in the hands of the local bishop, which from a traditional Catholic point of view isn't that radical of a thing. Having the local bishop be the prime arbitrator of liturgy in his diocese. That's actually a very Catholic thing, very traditional thing. Now, I think where it may have gone a little far in some people's minds is when it more or less said that they couldn't be using parishes and they couldn't start new communities. I believe it said those things. Is that correct?
Effectively, it
Yeah.
limited the growth of it for sure, and
But-
the places that it could be celebrated.
And I think the reason for that was there was this fear of many of these Latin Mass communities becoming places of poison and vitriol. Now, near me, there's a Latin Mass community, maybe about 20 minutes away, that's awesome. The priest there is a truly holy man. I have many friends who go there, and it's an awesome, awesome community. In my experience, many of the communities are like that. But I've also experienced Latin Mass communities that really are places just brimming with hatred. And I think there are more than a few like that. When this thing came out from Pope Francis, a good friend of mine who's a very devout Roman Catholic who worshiped in Latin Mass communities for decades said to me, he said, you know what? He said, I'm on board with this. I said, really? I was surprised. I thought he'd be really opposed to what he said. And what he said to me was, he said, I've seen so much anger and rage in the Latin Mass community. Anything we can do to contain it, we need to contain it. That was his perspective. Almost like it was something that needed to be contained because he'd seen so much poison come out of it. Now that's sad. And I don't think that reflects everywhere by any means. But I have seen it. I knew one young man a couple of years back who was a faithful Roman Catholic, wonderful young man, just full of love, wanted to serve Christ. He got involved with a Latin Mass community in his area, and he changed. He went from talking about Jesus, talking about evangelization, talking about growing the church, to basically raving against Pope Francis nonstop, day in and day out, towards condemning all kinds of things that really didn't need to be condemned. I mean, you've gone diatribes about things that really are pretty reasonable, things such as communion under both species, things of that nature. And then he became very anti-Eastern. That happened as well too. He began to talk about the old Roman rite being the one true rite. And it was like he changed completely when he got involved in this community. And I don't think that's an unusual experience. So as some people have said, maybe it's possible that the Latin Mass community to a certain degree brought this on themselves. But that being said, that by no means represents the whole of the Latin Mass community. The ones I've interacted with personally have, for the most part, been very positive, very wonderful places.
Yeah, I've kind of seen both, right? I've seen some of the really negative ones in that crowd, and then I've also seen other people who just really appreciate that patrimony a little bit more than the Novus Ordo, but aren't hostile to the church, the Postconciliar Church. But I don't know. I guess online, I tend to see a whole lot more of those who are very hostile. So I kind of understand where Pope Francis is coming from. That's not necessarily to say that one should have done everything, and made all of the decisions that he made, but I kind of understand where he's coming from.
Yeah, I was looking at a lot of documents on liturgy and liturgical reform recently.
Yeah.
And I keep running across this over and over again. The main principle of any liturgical reform should be the good of souls.
Mhm.
I keep seeing that. That's the main principle. Any liturgical reform should have the good of souls as being the first priority. And in a weird way, I can kind of see how in Pope Francis's mind, what he did here, this particular reform, was for the good of souls. He was trying to stop these communities from growing, because in his perception and the perception of many bishops, these communities have become a place where rancor and in some cases outright hatred is being fermented.
Yeah. Seems that that's the case. I have a question here about the changes that have happened in the post-conciliar era liturgically to the Eastern churches. But before I get to that, did you have any other comments about some of the post-conciliar changes in the Roman Rite before we get to that?
Yes, and I'll make one last one on that. I think that one of the difficulties in all of this is if you look at the history of it, any liturgical change that comes from the top down is going to be met with a lot of opposition. Top-down liturgical changes are oftentimes they oftentimes become occasions for great unrest, not just in the Western Church, but in the Eastern churches as well. I mean, the prime example in the East would be the reforms of Patriarch Nikon. I'm sure you're familiar with that situation.
Right.
He was a Russian Orthodox patriarch who had seen that a lot of, foreign practices had crept into the Russian Orthodox liturgy. He wanted to go back to what he saw as a more pristine, older form of it. He used this as model the Church of Greece. So he began trying to reform the liturgical books. And he was met with intense opposition, outright hatred in many cases. There was a big schism. The old believers came out of that. And he ended up being deposed. And it was a huge disaster, and it created a schism that's still in effect today in Russian Orthodoxy. So anytime you do something top down like that, you're going to run into issues. So if I had one overarching criticism of what happened in the Western Church, apart from the implementation without transcendence, we'll call it, it might be that this perhaps came too much from the top down. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this a couple weeks ago, and he's a very, very smart guy who really knows liturgy better than I do, frankly. And he gave me some really good ideas, and I actually wanted to give him a shout out in the program, and he begged me not to. He was afraid that if I gave him a shout out, that he would be bombarded with internet trolls, because you know the nature of this topic, right? So I will not mention his name because he does not want to be bombarded with the trolls. But he made a point that I thought was very valid, which was the way this all went down from the top down. In many ways, it was the ultimate fruit of ultramontanism. Ultramontanism put so much authority, so much tradition even, in the hands of the Pope, that it made it possible for a Pope to unilaterally, dramatically change liturgy from the top down. And if ultramontanism hadn't been a thing with as much influence, it may have gone down very differently.
I don't know. I think that definitely influences things, but it seems that Trent and Vatican I asserted that the Pope has that authority. So even without ultramontanism, I still think that this would have been a possibility.
Maybe, but it may have happened differently, is what I think.
Right. I think so too.
There's a statement in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that's very relevant to this. I'll read it out to you. You've probably seen this before. This is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1125, paragraph 1125 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I'll read it to you. For this reason, no sacramental rite may be modified or manipulated at the will of the minister or the community. Even the supreme authority in the church may not change the liturgy arbitrarily, but only in the obedience of faith and with religious respect for the mystery of the liturgy. So even there, it says there's some limit in what the Pope can do to it. There's some limit to it.
Yeah, it can't be arbitrary.
Right. And
it has to be good for the good of souls. But then the magisterium then notes that it's up to the church, which would include the Pope, to determine whether that's the case. So that's kind of the catch-22. Well, yeah, it has to be for the good of souls, but then it's the church, that is the magisterium, that determines.
But what is the church, right? The church isn't just the bishops, the Pope. It's not just the magisterium. The church is all of us. And there's an idea of a sense of a faithful being involved as well too in these type of reforms.
Agreed, but I think in the context of what I'm quoting, it's specifically the magisterium.
Mhm.
So it would be the Pope and the bishops. They determine whenever it's good for souls. So I would say that the church has the authority to make the changes that it made in the post-conciliar era, but sometimes what one can maybe question the prudential implementation of
Right.
them, I suppose. So,
And to be clear, I think the church totally had the authority to do that in the West, totally.
yeah,
But was it prudent in the way it was done? What perhaps jaded me on this was I read part of the private memoirs of Louis Boyer.
yeah,
Have you seen those?
I have.
Yeah, and he was involved in all of this. He was on the liturgical commission, and he was very involved in the whole liturgical movement. And in his memoirs, it's pretty jading.
Mm,
He says that basically what it came down to is in these committee meetings, they'd be sitting there. In his mind, it was almost like they were creating liturgy by committee, and they'd have these arguments. And what it came down to was who could get the Pope's signature.
mhm,
And everyone was trying to sidle up to the Pope to get his signature. And if you got a signature on something, you were golden, and
mhm.
and nothing else mattered but the Pope's signature. And he was kind of bemoaning this as being not at all what he had envisioned. And I think that factor alone is perhaps where the ultramontanist tendencies came into play. Liturgy shouldn't be just about the right person getting the Pope's signature. It should be
Yeah,
something more organic than that.
absolutely. Wholeheartedly agree. So tell me about some of the changes that have been made, if there have been any, to the Eastern churches after the Second Vatican Council because of the Second Vatican Council. Some of the liturgical changes there.
Yeah, the big ones, of course. The big one ultimately is the de-Latinization. And Latinization is a topic in and of itself that is worth exploring. I know many people get offended when they hear the term Latinization. They think it means like the Latin Church is bad; it needs to be eliminated from the East. No, no, no. Latinization is a technical term that refers to elements from the Latin Church being artificially put into the Eastern Church in a way that does harm to the integrity of the Eastern tradition.
Mm,
And that has happened quite a bit in history.
mhm,
Interestingly enough, it mostly comes from the Eastern churches. The Eastern Catholics have oftentimes imported their own Latin practices and tried to shoehorn them in an effort to appear more Roman Catholic. And almost always it's been the Vatican telling us to do the opposite. The Vatican is always saying, be Eastern, be Eastern, be Eastern. But at Vatican II, they put it right there in the council documents that we have to be authentically Eastern. We have to restore our traditions wherever we lost it. So in the aftermath of Vatican II, most of the Eastern Catholic churches began a program to try and remove any artificial, inorganic Latin elements that had been shoehorned into our liturgies. Again, by ourselves. I mean, we put them there. The Latin Church never did in most cases. So it took time, but I think overall it was a pretty much a success. So in the Byzantine tradition, we have icon screens, right?
mm.
We have the screen. As a deacon, I go in and out of it constantly, incensing in front of it. It's an important part of our liturgical tradition. Probably the majority of Byzantine Catholic churches in this country did not have an icon screen before Vatican II.
Mm.
Now, I think it's pretty clear the majority do. There's still a few that don't for whatever reason, but the vast majority do. I mean, that's a pretty visible change. Other things you'd find, our liturgies tend to be a bit fuller now. There's a tendency to dramatically abbreviate divine liturgies in many of the Eastern Catholic churches to try and make them almost like a low mass. You don't find that as much anymore. In some places, these things still hang around. But on the whole, your average Eastern Catholic church is going to have a much fuller liturgy. And really, we shouldn't be significantly different than our Eastern Orthodox counterpart down the street. And I think today, if you walk into the majority of Byzantine Catholic churches in this country, by Byzantine Catholic, I mean any Catholic church that follows the Byzantine Rite, whether it's Ruthenian, Melkite, Ukrainian, Romanian. If you walk into the majority of them, you probably could not tell the difference between liturgy there and the liturgy at its Orthodox counterpart, except for the fact that we pray for the Pope.
Mhm.
And I think that's what the council actually envisioned, was that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, those are some of the positive changes. Were there any negative ones that came afterwards?
In the Eastern Catholic churches,
Mhm.
I've seen no negative changes from it, not one.
One of the things that you can see in the documents, it seems to call for Sacrosanctum Concilium seems to call for changes in the liturgy, not just for the Roman rite, but for all rites. So, were any of the texts of the liturgy altered in any way, or did that not come about?
I've never read Sacrosanctum Concilium in that way. Um, to me, it always appeared it was speaking only to the Roman rite.
Hmm. I think it was who was it who wrote Conciliar Octet? Was it Iden Nichols? I think.
Maybe.
Um, I believe in his commentary on Sacrosanctum Concilium, he makes that point, and that was the first I've ever heard of it, because I've always read Sacrosanctum Concilium as specifically for the Roman Rite, but I guess others have read it differently, so I didn't know if the Eastern churches were influenced by it.
I will say this: if the Eastern churches followed it, would be no different than we are right now,
Yeah,
because everything calls for is something that's already a part of our Eastern tradition.
yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point. I just didn't know, because there were some parts in the document that talk about making things shorter, so I didn't know if the text was altered in any way.
But yeah, that wouldn't address us at all.
Right. And I think that that's something that one could rightly and respectfully criticize about the post-conciliar changes. Um, I understand what the council fathers were getting at whenever they wanted to somewhat shorten the rite. Um, but it just kind of seems that maybe that went a little too far. What are your thoughts there?
I don't know. I used to have a much more negative perspective on the Novus Ordo
Mm,
until I got into graduate school and began studying the liturgical movement.
mhm,
And it seems to me that a lot of the shortening that went on
mhm,
was more about getting back to what they saw as patristic roots. It wasn't so much about shortening as much as it was removing layers that had developed over the centuries that may have been obscuring the original meaning.
mm,
Um, so those things I don't necessarily see as being a bad thing.
mhm,
But there's a danger too, though, I want to bring up, and this is a really important danger. There's a danger of romanticizing the past. There is. And that danger can apply to any liturgical tradition.
mm,
It could apply to the fans of the traditional Latin Mass. There's a danger there of romanticizing the Tridentine Mass as being the pinnacle of spirituality.
mm,
But there's also a danger for liturgical reformers to romanticize the patristic era, or to romanticize some primitive, Roman rite that may or may not have existed as they envisioned it. When you think about it, this has been a big problem. In the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther saw himself as going back to the older, more primitive form of Roman liturgy. Many of the Protestant reformers believed they were going back to the beginnings of Christianity in what they were doing liturgically. They were wrong in how they envisioned it, but they thought they were going back to the past. They were romanticizing the past. And in the Eastern Catholic churches too, there could be a possibility of romanticizing, liturgy in Constantinople, at Hagia Sophia in the 7th century. The reality is, no liturgical time was ever perfect. We talk about many liturgical reformers really romanticized the patristic era. But if you go back and read the church fathers, they had issues with how the liturgy was done then. I mean, St. John Chrysostom was talking about how people would come into his church and party. They'd be
mm,
having a divine liturgy and people were getting drunk and
mm.
men were hitting on women. And he said in many cases, it felt like you're in a tavern, not a church. Uh, I mean, there were problems then. There were problems then. St. Augustine says similar things. So there really is no golden age of liturgy. There always are problems, but we tend to focus back on an era and romanticize it and make it out to be the end all and be all. The truth of the matter is, what matters most is now. What matters most now is now, and how we reach souls, how we bring people closer to God right now. I think that's the most important thing. And if we're fixated entirely on the past, that's potentially dangerous.
I think that's a very good point. Jacob, thank you for your super chat. He has a comment here. The Maronite Divine Liturgy has been almost entirely de-Latinized, but now more resembles a simplified West Syriac liturgy, which is probably due to Sacrosanctum Concilium's influence. What do you think about that? Do you think there's truth to that?
Oh yeah, I do. The Maronite Church, they're in an interesting position because they have no exact direct Orthodox counterpart. And in some ways that makes it harder to delatinize. It's a lot easier to delatinize when you have an exact counterpart. So, for Ukrainian Catholics, when we were looking at delatinizing, it was very easy to look at the Ukrainian Orthodox, see what they were doing. The Maronites have no Orthodox counterpart. And, the West Syrian tradition is their tradition, but the Maronites have always had their own unique, flavor of it, so to speak. I haven't been to a Maronite liturgy in probably about 20 years. The last few I went to were beautiful, but there were very significant Latin influences there. My understanding is in many places it's improved dramatically, and hopefully that's the case.
Victor asks, any advice for someone who wants to be a Latin deacon in this culture that is hostile to any deacon clericalism? I want to be a deacon like in the East, part of the clergy.
I feel you, my friend. I feel you. I'm in a situation where I am an Eastern Catholic deacon and I work at a Roman Catholic college. And I'm in a Roman Catholic diocese where, for whatever reason, the deacons are forbidden from dressing as clergy. So I like to dress as clergy, not because it signifies any rank or gives me any pride, but because it gives me opportunities for ministry. People come up to me when they see me dressed in clerical attire and ask me to pray for them. People tell me their problems. It gives me a lot of opportunities to reach people, and I can be a visible sign of, Christ's presence as a servant in this world. But sometimes people look at me like I'm a monster or an aberration of some kind when they find out that I'm a deacon dressed in clerical attire. I've encountered that many, many times. They won't say anything, but I get odd looks like, "You're a deacon? Why are you dressed like clergy?" Because I am clergy. In the Latin Church right now, there's a tendency to really downplay the status of deacons in a very significant way, which is sad when you consider how many great saints were deacons. St. Francis, St. Vincent. I mean, there are a long, long list of great saints who were deacons. But I think what it comes down to in the Latin Church is the issue of celibacy. Because deacons are often married, there's a fear that people will get the impression that clergy can be married. Well, deacons are clergy and they are married, so yeah, clergy can be married. But I think the fear is that people would see that and they start to be open to the idea of priests being married. And as you know, that's a really, tense topic in the Latin Church. And there are a lot of people who want to defend the Latin tradition of celibacy, with a lower T. The Latin discipline of celibacy is more accurate. And in their minds, deacons who are married being seen as clergy undermines that position. But that's sad because deacons are clergy and they should be allowed to dress as clergy. Mm. Any advice I have for him? The advice I have is just to surrender it to God, put it in God's hands. And if you're forbidden from dressing as a cleric, well, trust the Lord and he will give you opportunities for ministry, whether you're dressed as a deacon or not. I mean, the most important thing is to live your life pursuing holiness, to be as Christ-like as you can. If you can be the presence of Christ in this world, whether you're wearing a cassock or a polo shirt, you can make a huge difference.
Tom asks, what constitutes proper organic development of the Mass liturgy? Who has that authority? The local bishop?
Oh, first of all, shout out to Tom. I know Tom. He's a good friend of mine, so happy to have you watching again, Tom. Yes, ultimately, it's the bishop who makes a determination. Is the bishop always right? No. But ultimately, the bishop makes that determination. Ideally, it'd be a bishop, talking with laity, talking with clergy, talking with people who have expertise in this. But ultimately, it's the bishop who makes a determination.
Another question here. Could one make the claim that the Eastern churches can more easily make changes, i.e., vernacular language usage, since they are smaller in size, less laity, priests, bishops, etc.?
I'm not sure smallness of size makes making changes any easier. I've seen some pretty contentious liturgical battles in Eastern churches that could rival anything you've seen in a Latin church. I mean, if you look even at issues regarding calendar in some of the Orthodox churches, that was a really hot topic, especially back in the 1990s, as I recall. There were churches that split, Orthodox churches that split over calendar issues. They were small little parishes, and they became even smaller, multiple parishes of people who split. So I'm not sure that the size has much of an impact on how difficult the change is. I think a bigger part of it is how people see the change. If they see the change as being something that ultimately benefits their spiritual lives and is explained to them properly, they'll probably be more open to it. But very often people are afraid of change, whatever that change is, and they just react to it in a way that's hostile. And again, I'm sympathetic with that because we need to worship God in a way that's consistent. We as human beings are creatures of ritual. We want to be able to go to church every Sunday and know we can worship God in a consistent way. And that's why if you belong to a parish where your pastor is doing liturgical experimentation and your worship is radically different week after week after week, that's going to be jarring for you. That's going to pull you out of worship. I can see why people get very upset about that.
Yeah, absolutely. How can one prepare for participation in a Eastern rite for the first time?
Okay. First time visit to an Eastern Catholic church.
Yeah.
Father Daniel Dozier, Robert Klesko from EWTN, and myself made a video explaining how to do this. It's a video for first-time participants at the Divine Liturgy, kind of giving an overview and helping you to participate better. So I don't remember the link offhand. We still need to upload it to our YouTube channel, but it's currently on Vimeo, I believe. But
Is it Becoming Byzantine?
So Becoming Byzantine is actually our series, which is an overview of the Catechism, the Byzantine, Ukrainian Catholic Catechism. But we also did a video specifically on the Divine Liturgy.
Wow. I want to see this.
Yeah. I mean,
if you could send it to me afterwards, and I'll include it in the show notes for everybody so they can watch
yes, I will send you the link to it. I believe it's on Vimeo presently. We intend to add it to our YouTube channel, but we haven't gotten around to it yet.
Okay. Well, just whenever you get it, just send it to me and I'll add it to the show notes. That's awesome.
But that might be helpful to you, to the person asking the question, I mean.
By the way, shout out to y'all for doing that Becoming Byzantine series. I've been watching that. I haven't finished it yet, but it is awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It was Father Daniel's idea, and Father Daniel is such an amazing guy, and I love working with him. I love working with Robert, and it's been a joy. And I love the participants. We have good questions coming our way all the time. I've been getting a lot of feedback from people. It's been very positive and constructive, and I'm loving it. I'm enjoying it. But thank you, Michael. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Now, does Father Deacon think that there will be more Eastern Catholic churches in the U.S. for us who feel called to be Byzantines?
Yes, I do. I'm in the Eparchy of St. Josaphat. It's a Ukrainian Catholic diocese, and I'm on the Evangelization and Mission Committee. And we're very much involved in trying to support missions developing throughout the United States. And it's pretty incredible. We're actually having some significant growth. Most Roman Catholic dioceses and most Eastern Catholic dioceses have been going down in numbers over the past few years. The last numbers I saw, we were going up. Now, most of the increase is in places in the South, where we have some pretty amazing priests who are establishing missions left and right. But I think there's a movement towards more of this. And I know, Michael, you've been doing some amazing things in Louisiana, which I'm super excited about, by the way, super excited about. But I see more of that happening. I do believe we're going to see more Eastern Catholicism in this country.
I think so too. I'm seeing it a lot from people that I talk to. a lot of people that are interested in going and visiting an Eastern Catholic church for the first time or transferring their rite,
Yeah.
or who are not Catholic and want to join the church and are wanting to do it through the Eastern Catholics. I've been coming across that a lot.
I have too, both online and in real life. Right now there's a young lady who's been coming to our parish who we're going to be baptizing hopefully in a few months,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
she discovered it on her own and she's drawn towards it. And I see that more and more.
This one is from James. Do you recommend evangelizing Orthodox to become Eastern Catholic?
No, I do
Okay.
not. First of all, they don't need evangelized. They already have the gospel. There was an agreement between the Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church not to proselytize one another, the Balamand Agreement. And, it was signed off by the highest authorities in both Eastern Orthodoxy and in Catholicism. We're to recognize each other as brothers because the goal is to reunite as one. The goal is for the Orthodox and the Catholics to come together as one church again. That's the goal. And if we're trying to proselytize them and they're trying to proselytize they're trying to proselytize us, that completely destroys that goal. It builds barriers, trying to convert one another. So no, we should not even be attempting to do that. That being said, I've encountered more than a few Orthodox clergy, both on the internet and in real life, who make it a point of trying to proselytize Eastern Catholics. And I find that deeply troubling.
Now, somebody's going to immediately follow up and ask, well, aren't they in danger not being in communion with the Pope? And if so, if not, does that just then mean that being in communion with the Pope is something that's not really essential?
The way the church would answer that is that the Orthodox are in a way part of the Catholic Church, not in a perfect way, but they are in a way because they're receiving the same seven sacraments that we are.
Mm.
They're participating in the same liturgy, the same mass as the Catholics are. I mean, they really are us with an imperfect communion.
Mm.
Um, so it's not being relativist. It's not dismissing the papacy to say that they're saved, but the reality is they are almost perfectly Catholic, but not quite. That's a good way of looking at it. And for people who are born in that tradition, who join that tradition from, Protestantism or whatnot, they're there through no fault of their own. It's a different story if you have a Catholic who purposely rejects the papacy and walks away and becomes Orthodox. That's a different circumstance altogether.
Mhm.
But for people who were born Orthodox or who joined it from other traditions, they're as close to us as you can get. We
Right.
should not be evangelizing them because they already have the gospel.
There's another one here. Do Eastern Rite churches have a daily missal for the laity? Something similar to the 62 Roman missal.
Okay. The language here is a thing. Roman Missal. When I think of Roman Missal, I think of the book that's kept up on the altar. Are they referring to like something else?
But not necessarily the one that's on the altar, but just the one that as a layman you would go through while you're participating in the liturgy.
Okay. We don't have anything like that for daily use. I assume by daily use they mean it has like the propers for each day in it and whatnot. Is that
Right, because
yeah.
in the Latin parishes, the congregation, they're able to just kind of go into the pew, grab something and see what the readings are for that week.
We have nothing like that. And part of it is, and I actually addressed this in the video on it, attending your first divine liturgy. Ideally, in an Eastern Catholic church, you're not looking at a book. Ideally, you're there singing from the heart. See, our liturgies are very much about active participation from the laity. The laity and the clergy, we sing back and forth the whole liturgy. And if you're really into it, you're singing almost nonstop back and forth. So having a book in front of you isn't necessary, and it's certainly not ideal. It's certainly not ideal. So we have books. In my parish, we have a pew book. You can pick it up. It has liturgy in it. It doesn't have propers for each day, so to speak, but it does have the liturgy in it and some of the changeable parts. And that's very useful when you're new. If you've been coming for a while and you are familiar with the rhythm of the liturgy, you can pick up the book and learn to follow along with it. And it's helpful. I don't recommend newcomers ever do that. Newcomers need to just come and experience and take it in. But at a certain point, looking at the book becomes helpful. But at a certain point, it becomes even more helpful to put it away.
Tom asks, what role can the Byzantine churches play in helping the Coptic church move forward towards full communion? Their 72 and 2017 statements are favorable. Any comments on that?
And in the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure the Byzantine, Catholic churches have a lot of impact on that particular dialogue. I think the most important thing we can do is continue to be a witness of the East within Catholicism. I think that makes it easier for there to be communion between the various, Oriental Orthodox churches in Rome and with us. Ultimately, we want them to be in communion with us when they're in communion with Rome, of course. But there's a danger too of Byzantine Christians getting their nose into Oriental Orthodox business, and historically, that's not been a good thing. I mean, I'll be the first to say it. Historically, the Byzantine Rite has been extremely chauvinistic against other rites, like much more so than the Latin Church ever was. I mean, there's a long tradition of Byzantine Christians trying to force other Christians to become Byzantine.
Right.
It's really there, and it's pretty sad. So, because of that, many of the Oriental Orthodox are suspicious of Byzantine Christians, whether they're Byzantine Catholic or Byzantine Eastern Orthodox. So us being involved in their affairs is probably not the best thing. But that being said, the more we can do to open up the Roman Church to understanding and appreciating the East, the more that helps dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Oriental Orthodox.
Last question here. What are the Vatican documents that allow Eastern Catholics to venerate Orthodox saints? I'm all for this. Just wanted a resource if Father Deacon knows. This is one that comes up non-stop, because Eastern Catholics, some of them venerate Palamas because he's in the calendar and things like that. So if you could maybe briefly address that.
So a lot of Eastern Catholics have a private devotion to Orthodox saints, private personal devotion. So I, for example, have a tremendous devotion to, St. Paisios of Mount Athos. I love him. I love his books. I love his writings. I love his spirituality. Do I think he should be on my Ukrainian Catholic calendar? No, I don't. But there are some saints who are post-schism Orthodox saints who are on my calendar, like St. Gregory Palamas, and there are others as well. And the question is, what gives us the authority to do that? Is that the question?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Is there anything official that allows an Eastern Catholic to do so?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example here. So, every year this comes up, St. Gregory Palamas, especially when we celebrate his feast in Lent, Great Lent. People always rile about this, and the internet, they get really worked up over this for some crazy reason.
Right.
But he's on our calendar. He's on the Typicon for my eparchy. And the reason he's there is because he's in the official liturgical books for my church. They were published by the Vatican. So I mentioned before how Rome has always been very interested in keeping the Eastern Catholic churches Eastern. In many cases, more than we were interested in doing it ourselves. So there was a period of time in which the Roman Church actively worked on reforming our liturgical books to help us become more authentically who we're supposed to be. And they published a set of liturgical books for the Ruthenian churches. Now, in this country, when people think Ruthenian, they think like, Archeparchy of Pittsburgh. But the reality is the Ruthenian recension of the Byzantine Rite is used by both Ukrainian Catholics and Ruthenian Catholics. So the official books from Rome that the Ukrainian Catholics use are the same official books from Rome that the Ruthenian Catholics use. And Rome published a series of books for us, trying again to help us be more authentically Eastern. And the devotion, the commemoration of St. Gregory Palamas is right there in those books. So Rome published books for us to use that have him in it. So in many cases, that's the situation. We have a lot of post-schism Orthodox saints on our calendar, and in many cases, they were put in our liturgical books by Rome.
Somewhat of an implicit canonization of them, right?
It is. I mean, when you think about it, this is not unheard of. there are a number of post-schism Orthodox saints who are venerated in the Catholic Church, not just obscure people either. I forget the name of him, but there was a doctor of the church, one of the doctors
Gregory of Narek, yeah.
Exactly. He was never in communion with Rome. He was
Right.
an Oriental Orthodox saint,
Right.
but he's a doctor of the Catholic Church. So
Yeah.
this is not
Yeah.
that unheard of.
Yeah. I remember when Pope Francis made him a doctor of the church, everyone freaked out. Yeah, really good point. Well, there's so many other questions, but we'll end it there. Father Deacon, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this. I always love having you on, by the way.
And thank you, Michael, for entertaining this powder keg. I appreciate it. Hopefully the trolls take it easy on me, because I am sympathetic with them. I am.
I have appeared to be good in the chat, so
Cool.
they
Hey,
take it well from you.
Rad Trads, Orthobros, I love you all. I do.
Indeed. Thank you so much for coming on, Father Deacon. Is there anything that you want to put in a plug for?
Yeah, the Becoming Byzantine series.
Yeah.
This is a series for people who are interested in Eastern Catholicism, and we're working our way through Christ Our Pascha, Ukrainian Catholic Catechism, but really it's applicable to all Byzantine Christians. And we have we do a live webinar once a month. And we also have recorded lessons that are available each week with more information and greater depth. So to find us, do a search online for Becoming Byzantine. If you type in Becoming Byzantine in my name, perhaps it'll get you there. But I recommend checking it out. It's really fun. I'm enjoying doing it, and I think people love participating in it. So check us out.
Yeah, I've loved it. I'm on. I think I'm on lecture episode 4, however you want to call it, or 3 actually. Yeah, it's 3. So still working through it myself, but loving it so far.
Thank you.
Everybody, be sure to check out Becoming Byzantine. I'll put a link to it there in the show notes. Also, check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology, if you want to support us. And don't forget to subscribe, as I always say, and hit the bell for notifications so you know whenever we're going live. All right, that's going to do it. Till next time, God bless you all.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause,